Hi, this is Dr. Fritz Mora. Today we're going to be doing a simultaneous tooth preparation of number 3 and 4 for all ceramic crowns. Number 3 will be receiving a zirconia crown with a chamfer margin design, and number 4 will be receiving a lithium disilicate crown with a modified shoulder design. As usual, we will begin by placing our mock finish line. And when we do this, we're basically placing the finish line where we want it for the final preparation so that we won't be hitting the margin during the rest of the preparation. This is akin to when you're using a coloring book or a paint by number and you're drawing in the edges of the shapes so that you can quickly fill in the insides later. I strongly recommend approaching preparation in a systematic way where each step is finished completely before moving on to the next step. For more details about the specific techniques demonstrated in this video, I would definitely recommend you check out the previous preparation video, which was ACC 9. Which really goes into a lot of detail about using the handpiece and positioning of the burrs. So far, these buccal mock finish lines have been placed with direct vision. Now moving to the palatal, we're going to utilize indirect vision with the mirror placed directly behind the lower anterior teeth to visualize the palatal side of the teeth and produce the palatal mock finish line in the same manner. We can see that the handpiece and the burr is moved in a systematic way, moving from mesial to distal to place our mock finish line with a controlled motion. We really don't want to be scrubbing back and forth or adjusting places as we see them. We prefer instead to place it correctly the first time so that we can move on to the next step. Here I take a little extra time to refine the mock finish line so we don't have to come back to it later. With our mock finish lines completed, we'll move on to the interproximal reduction. For the interproximal reduction, I begin with a thin 850 type burr, and I begin on the coronal aspect and move apically with each stroke. This way, I'm reducing a little bit of the bulk with each stroke, and I'm not having to cut through the entire tooth all at once. This will maximize our control. Notice how our view in the mirror is aligned with the cut and with the burr so that we can see the entire length that we're cutting, and we can see that thin shell that we're leaving there so that we know we're not hitting the adjacent tooth or going too deep or cutting blind in any way. Here we're moving on to the interproximal reduction between number 3 and 4. Because both teeth are being prepped, we can do this very quickly. Our interproximal separation between number 2 and 3 is done in exactly the same way, with the mirror view lined up with the burr and the cut, and we proceed slowly from coronal to apical. Feel free to wedge the teeth to give yourself a little more leeway while you're working. We'll continue the interproximal reduction by moving to our green 016 chamfer burr and keeping our view in the same place it has been so that we're lined up with everything and we can see that we're avoiding the adjacent tooth. Again, feel free to wedge between the teeth to give yourself a little more space and move slowly here. While working, I'm looking at the tip of the burr to ensure that it's right on the edge of the margin, and I'm tilting the burr just mesial enough that it's not hitting the adjacent tooth. I'm not super worried about TOC at this point because as long as our reduction is minimal, it should be okay. For the interproximal separation between 3 and 4, again, we move quickly through there because both teeth are being prepped. You can see the view that we used here. While we have our view set up, we'll refine the interproximal reduction of number 3 with the chamfer burr because that is the margin that it's going to be, but we are not going to do the same thing on number 4 because number 4 is going to be a modified shoulder margin. So we'll go ahead here and again keeping the tip of our burr right at our margin. I would recommend that when you achieve good visual access to an area that you go ahead and prepare everything that you can from that area. In this case, I am preparing on number 4 with the chamfer burr, but I would recommend that you go ahead and just switch over to the shoulder burr to save yourself the extra step later. Now while we have this excellent view of the palatal, we're going to go ahead and do our depth cuts for the axial reduction. What I'm going to be doing here is lining up our burr with the palatal wall and sinking the burr into the tooth structure until the tip of the burr reaches our margin. Doing as many depth cuts as possible makes it really easy to know that you have evenly reduced tooth structure everywhere. Another thing is that by leaving only a thin amount of tooth structure between the depth cuts, it will be a lot easier to smooth them out later. Here I am adding depth cuts to the functional cusp bevel. I forgot that the functional cusp bevel is going to have a 1.5 millimeter reduction in this design, and so these depth cuts are 0.5 millimeters. I don't smooth them out yet though, so actually later on we'll go back and deepen them to the correct depth. There's a good view of what your depth cuts should look like here. And then we'll go ahead and start smoothing out that axial reduction. You can see that because there's very minimal tooth structure between the depth cuts, they actually smooth very quickly with light brush strokes. Here is our buccal view once again, and we'll go ahead and repeat our depth grooves on this side. In previous videos, I used a mechanical pencil to color in the deepest point of the depth grooves so that you can tell while you're smoothing them when you've reached the proper depth. I do not use that technique in this video, but of course you can still use that technique for this project. Proceeding with some depth grooves for our buccal bevel, this is basically a second plane of reduction, and we are ensuring that we have some reduction for material thickness. Remember to slant the burr at an oblique angle to the depth grooves when you're smoothing out the depth grooves so that the burr does not drop into the depth grooves and make a bumpy surface. We'll repeat the same technique to smooth the second plane of reduction on the molar. Switching to our modified shoulder for number 4, we'll go ahead and do our axial reduction. In this case, I actually did not use depth grooves for the axial wall because I know that we'll have plenty of reduction once we have that shoulder set there, but I do depth grooves on the second plane area to ensure proper reduction and enough thickness for our material. I would recommend getting the surface as smooth as you can with the green burr, but remember that we are going to be going back over this with the red diamond. Here we'll deepen our axial wall with the modified shoulder, and take note of how I'm using my left hand to stabilize the burr with that extra finger there. This is again a demonstration of the bimanual technique, which gives you much more control having both hands on the burr. So if you're not using the left hand for a mirror, definitely use it to stabilize your handpiece. We'll go ahead and get our axial reduction to that 1 millimeter shoulder that we want by making sure the entire burr fits on the finish line. Here I'll demonstrate that the interproximal reduction can be done with direct view, but if this view is too hard to get clinically, or if you're more comfortable, you can use the mirror as we did at the beginning. But if you can get this direct view, it allows you to use both hands, again, to utilize that bimanual technique, and it also gives you a straight shot through. Notice, however, that this view is difficult to get between tooth number 2 and 3, while the mirror view was consistent in all 3 positions, and so that might be better utilized for the interproximal separation between number 2 and 3. I would recommend trying both techniques, as one might be easier than the other depending on the situation. Once again demonstrating the palatal mirror placement, and we're going to go ahead and place our palatal axial wall depth grooves with the shoulder burr, and then quickly smooth them out. As I mentioned before, I would recommend completing this step when we have the palatal view initially, and just changing the burr at that time. You can see that the line angles were left very sharp in this instance, so I'm going to go ahead and round them out while I'm here. Moving on to our occlusal reduction, I position the mirror in front of the lower left canine to look back at the tooth. By placing the mirror this far away, we ensure that there's no water spray getting on the mirror, and we can see our 1.5 millimeter depth grooves clearly from in front of the tooth without crossing our hands. We place 1.5 millimeter depth grooves on our non-functional cusp, on our functional cusp bevel from this same view, and then we switch to the direct view in order to place our 1.5 millimeter depth grooves on the functional cusp. We gauge our 1.5 millimeter reduction by going another 0.5 millimeters beyond the 1 millimeter diameter of the burr. In this view, we can start to appreciate our depth grooves in cross-section. Showing our buccal direct view, we'll repeat this process using the modified shoulder for the molar. We'll go ahead and bury our burr 1 millimeter for the non-functional cusp, and try to visualize where the surface of the tooth structure was as you're making the depth grooves to ensure proper reduction. When we get to the buccal groove and the central fossa of the tooth, you'll have to bury the burr more than you think because the top of the burr needs to reach the previous deepest point of the occlusal surface. You can verify the depth of your depth grooves by using a perio probe and visualizing where the surface was previously. And then we'll go ahead and smooth off the buccal non-functional cusp before we proceed to the palatal functional cusp. We'll just make quick moves here, and because there are thin bits of tooth structure between the depth grooves, they smooth out very quickly. Moving on to the functional cusp, we'll require a 1.5 millimeter reduction with this modified shoulder burr. We'll go ahead and sink that in. And then notice for the oblique ridge that I actually turn the burr and so that I can follow the anatomy, and this will give us a consistent, even reduction that follows the natural anatomy of the tooth. Take a look at how deep that burr needed to go to achieve the reduction at that depth of the occlusal groove. As I mentioned, we can confirm the depth of our depth grooves with the perio probe and make sure that your depth grooves are parallel to the occlusal surface of the tooth so that they mirror the anatomy of the tooth. Once again, we'll go through and smooth off our occlusal surface, Take note again of how the burr is obliquely positioned relative to the depth grooves so that it's not falling into those depth grooves as we're smoothing. We'll go ahead and repeat the same smoothing steps on the premolar using the modified shoulder for the occlusal. And now back to our palatal view, we'll be finishing up the functional cusp bevel on the molar. As I mentioned, these depth grooves were insufficient, and so I did not smooth them out. Here they're about 0.5, and I'm going to be reducing them to the correct 1.5 millimeter reduction. We're going to go ahead and slot the burr into those grooves and go ahead and deepen it until we see those struts of tooth structure between are about 1.5 millimeters tall. We'll go ahead and smooth it off after that, and once again, because those struts of tooth structure between the depth grooves are very thin, it smooths out very quickly with that oblique angle of the burr. Our preparation finish line is best evaluated from the occlusal surface, and so we'll go ahead and take this view and we can see clearly that the mesial of our premolar is not reduced sufficiently. We'll go ahead and correct that now. And at this point, we're going to move on to the red diamond burr to make the minor corrections to our preps that we see. Whenever smoothing, we want to be rolling with the burr, so change the burr rotation direction accordingly. Now when we reevaluate from the occlusal, we can see that the mesial is corrected. It is now the width of the burr, as is the distal, but we do need to resurface the finish line with the red diamond and bring it down to the appropriate level. So we'll go ahead and work on the lingual line angles now. Take note of how we work from mesial to distal systematically from one area to the next without repeating or moving around erratically. You want everything to be smooth and controlled to develop your systematic approach to tooth preparation. These are our final touches to this area of the margin. We don't want to be repeating steps, so we want to make sure that we are satisfied with the appearance of the margin before moving on. The mesial, palatal, and distal of number 4 are acceptable. By positioning the mirror close to the tooth, you can point at areas as you evaluate them to pinpoint the locations that need adjustment. Here we're finding out that the buccal side needs adjustment, both on the mesial and the distal. We'll go ahead and continue with our systematic movements to go from one side around the tooth with controlled movements to smooth the finish line. At this point, we are rolling with the burr for smoothing, and the burr is rotating between 10 and 60,000. I believe in this particular instance, I'm using about 40,000. You can use 20,000 for very much more minor adjustments, or 60,000 if you want a little bit more cutting efficiency. Here I felt that the number 4 functional cusp bevel needed a little bit more smoothing and flattening, so I go ahead and make the appropriate changes, again with light movements. Now assessing the molar, we can see that the line angles are not sufficiently reduced. The buccal is also severely under-reduced, which we will see in a moment. We'll go ahead and start adjusting those line angles, once again with a slow burr speed and controlled movements. Now I was not satisfied with the quality of the finish line from this viewpoint, so I went ahead and worked from the mid-palatal to the distal and through the interproximal, all with one burr rotation and speed. And then I'm going to be moving to the opposite side of the tooth to do the same thing on the mesial half, and for that I simply switch the direction of spin of the burr so that again I'm rolling with the burr. At this point I want to be finalizing my finish line position and smoothness. Now I want the entire side of the burr to be in contact with the side of the tooth at all times so that the preparation reflects the contour of the burr that I'm using, and so I'm not putting a lot of pressure axially. I am simply aligning the burr and gliding it along the preparation that exists, and I am watching carefully where the point of the burr meets the finish line of the preparation. Now this is a commonly missed area to smooth, the mesial axial occlusal line angle. on both the molar and the premolar. So I'm going to go ahead and smooth those out deliberately here with one burr rotation direction, and then I'm going to switch the burr rotation direction and do both the distal of the premolar and the distal of the molar. So you work mesial, mesial, distal, distal. That way you don't have to change the rotation of the burr as often. Here is where we see that the buccal of number 3 is actually massively undercut. That's due to the natural contour of the tooth. We didn't reduce enough axially. So you'll see here how I borrow the angulation of number 4 buccal and apply it to number 3, and then I begin reducing that. That way the teeth align nicely, and you can borrow from the correct TOC of number 4 to correct number 3. We'll go ahead and reduce that until the tip of the burr reaches the margin while holding that angle, and that way we'll know that we have the sufficient reduction and the correct TOC. Make sure to evaluate your preparation from multiple views. From this more buccal view, by turning the head of the mannequin, we can see the distal buccal more clearly and see that the margin was too high. So we go ahead and lower it. We'll begin rounding the buccal cusp of both the premolar and the molar. And anytime you're doing any rounding, you want to be subtly changing the angulation of the burr so that you round it from all angles. Here you can see clearly those subtle rotations of the burr. Rotate, rotate, rotate. And take a look at how much smoother that cusp looks now. Now we'll repeat the same thing on the molar. Whenever smoothing, you want to be rolling with the burr, but you also want to be using light brush strokes. So you're never forcing, you're never cutting into the tooth structure. You simply allow the handpiece to glide over the tooth and allow the sharpness and the rotation speed of the burr to remove a little bit of tooth structure with each stroke. We are almost finished smoothing now, so I'm going to let the video play and you can watch for some of those techniques that I mentioned. Evaluating the buccal finish lines and smoothness of the preps, it is acceptable. Looking at the occlusal, however, there is still some roughness. This is the only time I will advocate for the use of a football burr is for adjusting concave areas. So I go ahead and run the burr at a slow speed, again around 40,000, into those concave grooves of the occlusal surface of both the molar and the premolar. Finally, we will evaluate our preparations from the occlusal surface. I noticed that the mesiobuccal of the molar is slightly narrow, and that is something I might correct, but for today, this is an acceptable preparation. Thank you for watching, and please let me know if you have any questions.